Hello, I want to use this video to explain how to conduct this project. So in the lessons, you can see that I posted some materials related to the group term project. If you click on the link, first you can see a bunch of videos. This basically for you to review your knowledge about linear regression models. If you do a search on the web, you can find hundreds or thousands of videos on this topic. So feel free to search on your own, but this is what I found to be very straightforward and explains very clearly. So you can just use this to review your knowledge about this model. And in addition to that, I also posted this is a scanned copy from a textbook chapter. If you click on that, the textbook title of the textbook is called Practical Business Statistics. So the chapter title is called Correlation and Regression. Even though this is long, but actually it's very easy to read. And the best about this book is that it actually gives you the guidance on how to use Excel to do many of the statistical functions, also including the regressions. This is relatively long, as I said. Another one, linear regression PDF file. This is relatively that's shorter, so you can, if you are not very patient and want to read a shorter one, you can try this one. But the downside of this one is that it includes more math. So if you love math, that may be good for you. If you don't, the other one might be better. So it's up to you. And project instructions. Before I talk about this instruction, I have to thank Professor Dan Janowski for allowing me actually to use many of his write-ups, including this instruction I borrowed heavily from his handout. So for any project, we start from an idea. So you can look at the elements of a completed project. You have idea first, and then you analyze your idea, but you don't analyze with your just bunch of hunches or intuitions. You analyze with the models we learned in this class. And then you use the data to test that idea and to test whether your prediction based on the model we learned in this book is correct. And then you run the models, regression models, to do that. And then you further check whether results are consistent with your prediction, and if there's any discrepancy and what might be the reason for that, and then finally you summarize it. So that's basically the fundamental elements of a completed project. And then we start from an idea. So where do you get an idea? Basically, you can get it anywhere. You can come up with your own, or if you want, I actually have posted our list of possible topics for the project. So this is by no means exhaustive, so feel free to come up with your own, but these topics are based on the models we learned in this book. So I'm going to take one of these as an example to show you how to conduct the project. I'm going to pick this number 3 here. Analyze the impact of an increase in government budget deficit on interest rate. So this is only one single variable. So if you learn the regression model, from this you can see that the dependent variable should be the interest rate, and the independent variable should be the budget deficit. right? Because we're gonna try to find out what's the impact of the budget deficit on interest rate. And in this book, we also learned the determinants of interest rate. One of the determinants is the budget deficit. So once you use the idea, next step is to figure out how to what's the likely effect of budget deficit on interest rate, and that's where we need the model. So this is based on chapter 5. So chapter 5 is about the behavior of interest rates or the determinants of interest rate. We learned basically two frameworks: asset market framework and liquidity preference framework. So asset market framework is about the demand and supply of bonds in the market. It could be including the bonds here include the corporate bonds and also includes the government bonds or the treasury bonds. And the liquidity preference framework is based on the supply and the demand in the money market. So we have the demand for money and we have the supply for money. So that determines the interest rate. And back to the asset market framework, we have the demand, we have the supply, and their intersection is an equilibrium price of a bond. But from what we learned in chapter 4, we know that price and interest rate or yield to maturity is inversely related to each other. So once you know the price, you can also know the interest rate, but they are just inversely related. So based on this framework, how could we analyze the impact of budget deficit on the interest rate? So we know that if budget deficit means that the government spends more than it collects from the taxes. So how can the government finance the difference? The only means they can do that is by issuing bonds. Hence, the supply of bonds will increase. So that's going to impact the supply. And in which direction? Obviously, if it increases, the supply will shift to the right. So when it shifts to the right, you can see that price will drop. But as we said, price and interest rate are inversely related to each other. So when the price drops, interest rate has to go up. Hence, budget deficit, based on this model, will be positively related to the interest rate. So that's our prediction. And once you have this model and you predicted that, the next step, back to the instruction, is to use the data to analyze, to test that prediction. So then the question is, how do we find the data? Here, actually, if you look at the big picture expectations, you can find that number 3 here, it gives you a link about the common source for economic data theories, which is very useful. This is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So we can just do a search for Fred. Actually, many of our homework, real-time data series homework assignments are based on this website. So Fred economic data, just do a search, and here just click on the first link, and you can do a search on the interest rate. So here gives you a bunch of interest rate. You can use federal funds rate, which we learned in chapter 18. But in our framework, actually, because we are trying to see how budget deficit relates to the interest rate, this might not be the best one, because as we said, the general means for the government to finance the deficit is by issuing bonds. So it's better to use the interest rate that the bond market, which is in the bond market. So we can use for example, the 10-year Treasury constant maturity rate. If you click on that, you can just download it, download to different file types, and then you can do that, open it, and you can see the data points. So, but this is not the best way I recommend. Another way which you can get the data very easily is by following this instruction on the fourth point here. Gives you a link for the Excel plugin. So once you go to this link, you can just go to this link. You can see that you can download this this plugin to your computer. You need to enter your email address and agree. And then once you download, just follow the installation instructions to install it. And then what's cool about this website, this link, is also it gives you a video tutorial about how to use that Excel add-in. So since I already did this installation, so I'm gonna just use that. You can see once you install it, it has an additional thread tab. So once you click on it, you can get the data. So Brown's popular US data and the interest rate. Now, since we are interested in interest rate, we could go to money, banking, and finance. So that's where you can find a bunch of commonly used interest rate. So federal funds rate, 3 months treasury rate, 1 year treasury rate, 5 year treasury rate, and 10 year treasury rate. I'm going to pick up the 10 year treasury rate, but feel free to pick up 5 year treasury rate or even 1 year treasury rate. And the reason I pick up a 10 year treasury rate is because, generally speaking, when government wants to finance its deficit, probably is looking for the long run. So, but 5 year may also be applicable. So once I click on this, you can see the symbol, and then get thread data. Click on that. So here it will pop up the data for you. Right now it's in the daily format. So starting from 1962, every day you got a data point. If you don't want so many data, of course, obviously this will have a lot of data points, even 14,000, more than 14,000 data points. If you want to change this to, for example, annually, you can just do that very easily. That's why also another reason I recommend this plugin. Otherwise, you will probably have to do another search on the website and download another different time series data again. But with this, you can do it very easily. So just change that to BA, that stands for annual, and then update data. Actually, on that video tutorial, gives you the same instruction on how to do that. So here, just to briefly repeat that. So now you can see, you can also change this to annual. I see that starting from 1962, every year, and it's always at the beginning of the year, January the 1st. Every year now you have a data point. So now the data has been changed to the annual format. So that's basically the interest rate. And what about the budget deficit? So you go to Fred again and browse that. I think the deficit should be the national income and the expenditures. So almost at the bottom, you can see the federal surplus and deficit. So click on that and then get Fred data. And there you can see that the earliest date will be 1901. Since you want to match this time points with the interest rate starting time, so probably you don't need that many. You can just delete it. Delete the points that you don't want. So I'm gonna delete until 1961. So why do I keep until 1961, not 1962, since the interest rate starts from 1962? And the reason is that because in this model, we want the interest rate is the dependent variable. The budget deficit is the independent variable. So we want to make sure that the independent variable, they are either at the same time as the dependent variable, or they can be slightly earlier. But unfortunately, in this case, we don't have a very slightly earlier data point. What we have is actually 6 months, half a year earlier. But that's still better than later. So if you keep this and match that with 1962, and then the budget deficit will be actually 6 months later than the interest rate, and that's not good. So that's why I kept the starting year is June 30th, 1961. So now I have matched the basically the interest rate and the budget deficit. Another thing about the budget deficit I want to mention is you can see we have negative numbers here, we have positive numbers sometime. So the positive number here means budget plus, surplus, and the deficit here is a negative number. So the larger this value means actually the surplus. So even though our model is based on the prediction for deficit and interest rate, but the data here is actually about the surplus. But that's no problem. We can just change the sign of the prediction. Since we have predicted that deficit will be positively impacting the interest rate, so obviously surplus will be negatively affecting the interest rate. So that's our prediction. We can now erase that and maybe change the name interest rate or maybe INT, keep it short, and 10-year. And this will be the, as we said, this actually is the surplus, not the deficit. So we can just click on that, and this is date. So before we do the regression model, I suggest you to do some descriptive statistics. For example, you can look at the average number for the interest rate over the whole time period, average number for the surplus, and the maximum for the interest rate, the minimum, standard deviation, the median value for the interest rate. You can do that, and the same for the surplus. And in Excel, you can actually do that very easily. Click on data, and there's a tag called data analysis. By default, Excel actually doesn't have this. So if you want to install this, you can do that by clicking on File and Options. I'm going to skip that part. If you want to find out how to install the data analysis pack, you can just search on the web. That's very easy to do. So once you click on data analysis pack, you can see a bunch of statistical functions. So one is the descriptive statistics. So I'm going to click on that. So this will ask you about input range. Basically, you want to input the columns with the data. So actually, Excel has already identified that for you. So identify that. The last one actually is the interest rate doesn't have any value there, so we can just skip that, or we can do that later on. So I'm gonna delete this first, and then click on this data analysis again, descriptive analysis, and I think labels in the first row, you want to click on that because that gives you, that means that's telling Excel that the first row is about the variable name. And then output options, you can choose either on the same worksheet or different worksheet. And this is about summary statistics, so that's where I clicked. And then once you click on that, you can see that because I already have a bunch of sheets, so the number here actually is automatically 20. So you can make this to be look more beautiful. So the main interest rate will be 6.25, and the median is 6.10. So they're relatively speaking, they are close to each other. So this tells us that the interest rate is kind of symmetric around the mean. But that's not the case. If you look at the surplus, you can see that the mean and median, they have a huge difference. So that's telling us the surplus is not symmetric around the mean. And you can also tell that by the cutoff skewness. Skewness for the surplus will be much higher than the skewness for the interest rate. And you can also talk about the minimum and the maximum interest rate and surplus maximum. And for the surplus, the average actually is negative. So negative means deficit. So that means on average, government actually has deficit rather than surplus. And that's obviously that's consistent with our expectation. So that gives us some descriptive statistics about the model. And going back to the instruction sheet, that's the summarizing the data, and then some correlations. You can also do that based using the data and data analysis pack. So click on correlations, and then you can see Excel also automatically just choose the data points that it thinks which is valid, and turns out that's true. But you can always change that the input range. And then it will give you the correlation table in another worksheet. So the correlation between surplus and interest rate will be 0.45. So correlation, if you based on the knowledge in statistics, this means the measures the relationship between these two. So positive here means that they tend to co-move with each other, and the larger this number means that their co-movement seems to be stronger to some extent. So recall what's our prediction for the surplus and interest rate, because budget deficit should be positively related to the interest rate. So we said surplus should be negatively related to the interest rate. But is that the case here? Obviously not. This correlation here is positive. So this already says something about our model, right? Our prediction. So let's go on. And then we can do some plot. For example, we can do the scatter plot for the data. So going back to the sheet 1 where we have the data, you can do a scatter plot. You can do this if you just click on insert and scatter plot. You see that Excel actually automatically recognizes these data points. So it puts the first column as the horizontal axis, and then starting from the second column, it puts as the vertical axis. But now you have two variables, so that's why you have the different colors here. But what's bad about this, putting these two charts on the same, putting these two graphs on the same chart, is that they have very different scales. That's why it's very messy. So I'm going to change this. Probably only shows interest rate versus the time. So that's where you see. And the horizontal axis here is also kind of messy. And you can also change that by this, I think. By clicking on the chart elements axis, and then more options. And you can change this starting from, because here right now it starts from 1901, so you don't want to do that. You start from 1962. And then the next item is, the final item is 2017. So now it's more beautiful, right? This is a time trend for the interest rate. You can do the same for surplus. You can just copy it here, copy it, and then change. You can change this series to surplus rather than interest rate. You can just click on surplus, and then this will change to surplus or deficit. So from that, you can tell something about the time trend for both variables, right? For example, the surplus, you can see that surplus tends to be either surplus or deficit tends to be small before somehow 2000, and after that it gradually went from surplus to deficit and stayed there, briefly bounced back, and then went south, deeply in south. And that's the situation we are facing right now, right? So that's the surplus. And the interest rate is largely hump-shaped, right? Has a peak, sort of a peak, and then first it goes up and then went down, sort of like that trend. So that's the time trend. But remember, our focus here is about relationship between the surplus and how does the surplus or deficit impact the interest rate. So we probably want to do a different plot. In addition to this one, we can do plot surplus against the why don't I do a different chart rather than doing this? I'm gonna do interest rate and surplus. Actually, for this, it's better to move this to the left of interest rate because by default, if you make this, Excel will recognize a left column as the x-axis and the right column as the y-axis. And because here, the interest rate, we want to take that as a dependent variable. That's why I want to shift this position. So I click on that and choose these columns. I choose these two columns, and then insert scatter plot. So now you see that it's actually gives us the scatter plot for interest rate versus surplus. So does this look like a positive or negative relationship? This may not be so easy to see, but we can make it easier. We can make it easier by choosing these chart elements and add a trend line. The trend line actually is the same as the regression line. So you can see that trend line, obviously that's positive. So that's consistent with the correlation here. So after that, I guess we are in a position to do the regressions. So again, I think from the very early start, I mentioned that we have to make sure what's the dependent variable and what's the independent variable. In this simple example, we only have one independent variable, but feel free to have more independent variables. And now let's do this regression. So going back to the data and data analysis, here you can see the regression. So click on that. You want to regress y, input y range. Y is the interest rate, so we put that. And then shift, pull downward. And the x is surplus. And we want labels, right? Because I start from the first row. And then we want to new worksheet apply. And you can do residual plots. That's fine. If you don't want that, that's also fine. So once I click on OK, you can see the regression results. So it has the R square. So this measures the model fit. And also the F statistics. This basically is a measure of, as a whole, how does the model explain the dependent variable. And then, because we only have one independent variable, so that's the coefficient and we, by default, the linear model always has a constant, which is the intercept. So then you probably want to talk about the t statistic and the p-value. P-value, the lower the p-value, the more significant the coefficient is. So in this case, it's almost 0. So that means it's highly significant and consistent with the regression and also consistent with the scatter plot and trend line. We see that the coefficient on the surplus is positive. So then, next step is to analyze this result. So is that consistent with our prediction? Obviously no, right? Because we said surplus should be negatively related to the interest rate, but here it's positive and significant. So what might be the reasons for the discrepancy? Yeah, so that's the bonus points here. And one easily found reason might be that here we only look at surplus or deficit, right? But if you check chapter 5, we see a lot of factors actually can determine the interest rate, either from the demand side or from the supply side. So from the demand side, you can see the where's expected return and risk, liquidity, many of those variables, right? And from the supply side, you can also see the expected profitability, expected inflation, and in this case, government budget deficit, which is already what we are focusing in this example. So since we only have this variable as the only independent variable, and we don't include the other potential determinants of interest rate, so statistically speaking, we are having the so-called omitted variable bias. So that basically says we should have more independent variables, especially those independent variables are also related to the government budget deficit, which is likely, right? So if we have the omitted variable bias, and then the coefficient we have here may not be so reliable, this one here. Even though it's positive, but because of the bias, this may not be so reliable. So that might be one of the reasons to explain that. So then the best part, and this is the bonus part, is to do some additional analysis to see whether you can justify this kind of conjecture you have omitted variable bias. So for example, in chapter 5, we look at the personal income, right? Personal income can potentially also affect the interest rate. And based on the second framework we learned in that chapter, we know that personal income can in what direction does personal income impact the interest rate? So if your income goes up, probably you want to hold more money in your pocket because you want to shop more and earn that cash to buy more goods, right? So and then this is the demand for the money curve will shift to the right. So when it shifts to the right, interest rate will go up. And the difference between this framework and the other framework is that the vertical axis here is actually directly interest rate. Unlike the other one, it's the price, right? So we have to translate price into the interest rate. Here we don't need that translation. So based on this prediction of this model, the interest rate will be positively related to income. So let's see. And income is another potential variable that can impact the interest rate. And income can also be related to government budget deficit. So that's also that's the reason we have the omitted variable bias. So then the step on how to get the personal income and just copy the data I got. So you can follow the same steps I showed earlier on how to get the data, because the point here is to show you how to have this additional analysis. So now we want to do our so-called multiple regression model. So and click on data analysis, and regression again. So y-axis will be D, and until very end. And x-axis, now you have two columns instead of just one. So you want to do that, put that here. And you want to have labels and output to a new worksheet file, and just click on OK. So you can see that now you have two variables in the regression models: budget surplus, same as before, and personal income. So what's different in this case? You can see that after adding the personal income, what happens to the coefficient on the budget debt surplus? You can see it's still positive, even though we said based on our model this should be negative, right? But what the change is that if you look at the p-value, this means it's no longer significant. So compared with the earlier result, right? We remember we have the early result. If we go back to the early result, I guess it's, yeah, somehow. So why don't I run another regression to show you earlier results? That might be simpler. So y is still there, and I want to change this to add x just to be budget surplus. So this is actually our earlier results. You can see that, as we said, I think earlier this is just called the surplus. So maybe change this also to be just surplus, so you don't get confused. It's the same variable as before. Before we have this positive, and based on the p-value here is highly significant. But after we add the personal income variable, you can see that this is no longer significant, even though it is still positive. So the no longer significant part means that statistically speaking, we cannot say that surplus is not zero based on our model. So even though we would like this variable to be negative based on our prediction, and it's not, but after adding the personal income variable, this actually is moving in the right direction, or in the direction that we want it to move. So first positive, and then down to zero, and then since we said we probably have other variables that can also be related to the interest rate, so if you want to add more of those variables, you can try and see whether surplus will eventually probably move in the negative territory, which will be consistent with our models. So that's basically this project. And so after we have done this analysis, just to follow these elements, and then finally some kind of a summary. So I want to show you some samples, which are done by some students in the past. I think they did a very good job. So you can see that even though in this instruction, you can see that I said you can say, here's my idea, here's my data, here's my regression model, here's what, but you don't have to say those exactly words. You can just use the introduction, which is basically, here's my idea part, and then the data part, which is actually the here's my data part, and then the model, I guess, statistical analysis of the data, that's part of the data part, and then the regression model is also part. A model is to be estimated, so we want to input y and x, and You can also put y as, in that example, interest rate equals a constant plus beta times budget deficit or budget surplus, and then plus error term, right, for our model. So and then just show the results. And here it doesn't show a plot, but I would also like you to show a scatter plot. It did some residual analysis. You can do that, and then conclusion. So that's basically the very decent down project. I would just want to show you how it is done. So that's it for this group term project. I hope this is useful. So feel free to post any other questions on the forum, SciCat forum, so that I might further help you.